Hey guys, and welcome back for another episode of the Butterfly Effect podcast. I'm Jack, I'm here with Liam.
Bonjour.
And today we are going to be doing our Season 1 Prologue ranking. Okay, mate, so you're going to kick us off. We're going to go through these games chronologically and then put them in the slot that we think personally best fits. So, Man of Medan, mate, take it away.
Cool. So, I just want to say as well what the ratings are about, because it's so difficult to rank these prologues. I certainly had a tough time with it. A lot of them are aesthetic, a lot of them are cinematic, a lot of them affect the story. This is going to be very subjective, but this is what I've gone for. Man of Medan, 4th. So it doesn't win a medal here for me. I'll talk about what's good about Man of Medan first. So I think you have to cut it some slack. The reason it heavily falls 4th for me is because being the first game, it was very tutorial heavy. The first half of it probably focuses a lot on stuff like the heartbeat sequences, and doing that combat machine against the robot or the wooden thing. I don't even know what I'd call it. The training machine. The fight trait. Right, I've already fucked that. But...
I really don't know, mate. Just the punching doll or something like that. I don't know.
The punching doll. Yeah. So it focuses very much on how to play the game. Thus, it probably takes quite a lot of juice out of the story or the kind of the characters here. One thing I really did like about this prologue, though, is that it really sets up the era very well. I think they all do, but I really like the shots of the ghost ship, the coffins and the rooms that we'll see later on, and the Manchurian God. I really like the Chinatown they're in as well. It was quite a nice sort of scene. Now, where the prologue falls very flat for me is that, firstly, I think the characters here are super unlikable. I really did not get on with Joe and Charlie, and I get that they're two sort of drunkard soldiers, but I just, was not a fan of, how they're arguing over 50 cents or 2 quarters, whatever it is, or how Joe starts complaining about a tile he's got. It's that's the equivalent to falling out over what your star sign's given you, a horoscope. I think I ranked it quite low as well because, it didn't affect the story later on in the game like some of the other prologue things really do. I really enjoyed the curator cut version and how varied it could be playing as Joe versus Charlie. That was interesting, but it just doesn't affect the main story with the main 5 cast you'll get. Its last downfall, which I will mention, is that there are a lot of constant shots of the toxic Manchurian Gold box, and when Joe can see a little boy which Charlie can't, I'm pretty sure I clocked on the whole twist simply from the prologue, which I don't think I should have to have done. It would have been nice to have found that out in the game, not in the prologue. So I found the game very predictable for this reason, and that is why Man of Medan ranks 4th for me, mate.
Ah, interesting. Okay, so for me, Man of Medan ranks 3rd, and for me, I just really like the horror elements in here. I really like the colour palette, very moody blues, greens and greys. And talking about the era, as you mentioned, I quite like the whole war period, so I was on board with that straight away. You have this haunting music, obviously you've got the coffins draped in American flags. And you know what, the whole tutorial bit, I didn't necessarily mind it. I like the fact that you had to go at 2 different things. So obviously, yeah, you had the punching doll, and then you could go into this tent where you had your reading of some sort, oriental reading, and that again was a good sense of foreboding of things that were to come. Obviously, it doesn't matter each way, but when you're doing your blind playthrough, it all still feeds into it, doesn't it? And then of course you have the lightning again. It's really tapping into the horror. Mysterious gas, I do agree with you in that sense, with the fact the mysterious gas You think, well, perhaps they're hallucinating and that is literally the whole twist of the game, so maybe they could have kept that under wraps a little bit better. But in terms of like the main bulk of this bit, so again, I have to come back to the horror. You've got the moment where you have a jump scare where there's a body in the cabinet. It seems very psychologically driven because the characters almost wake up from a bad dream. You've got these soldiers that are, in sort of very strange positions, like when they're dead bodies with their mouths open. You've got the figure running across. You've got the tight corridors. For me, like the setting of Man of Medan is absolutely brilliant and is one of the strengths of this game. So I was very happy with that. I think as well, it gets another tick for me because of Curator's Cut. I love the fact that you play as Charlie in Curator's Cut. I mean, admittedly, it's a bit underwhelming because it's a timer, so you've basically got to wait for Joe to pick you up. I do love that ultimately the characters get separated, and then you can get a choice where, like, I think is it investigate or hide. If you hide in the cabinet, you're then there with the knife, and then of course if you play theatrical cut and you're playing as Joe and you open a cabinet, the little boy's in there and he like stabs and kills you. So that's almost like a hint that how the gas takes real people, but obviously in the mind makes you think that there's something else, something more horrific. So I really dig that, and the fact obviously that the prologue characters are essentially killing one another. So you know what, it was actually quite a pleasure going back and looking at the prologue for this game. I haven't seen it for quite a while, and I come out with more good things than bad, mate, but I would say that it does sit third place. Okay, so the prologue of Little Hope, for me, is the best of Season 1. I don't know if that's going to surprise some people, but I've got a lot of notes here because there are things that I like. Again, we have this sort of moody bluey green, when you're following Anthony as the bus driver. He then encounters the police officer who says he has to drive through Little Hope, and you can tell that this guy's a little bit unhinged. I think the one minus mark I would give this though is that when the bus driver says, "Oh, I just want to get these folks to where they belong," the police officer looks in, and obviously we know the twist of the game that no one's actually in there. You think, really? Like a police officer wouldn't get a bit suspicious about that. He's just like, okay, I'll let this guy carry on even though he seems a little bit unhinged, but there we go, moving on. But for me, the root of this Little Hope prologue is all to do with like the authentic family relationships. When you've got the mum and the dad going hammer and tongs at one another in argument, I was really buying into it, and I sat and I was thinking, I wish that we was playing with this family throughout the entire game, because the main cast later on I find a little bit underwhelming. You've got the creepy little girl. I love the lighting, like you really do get the sense that it's a family home. There's some nice nods to later on in the game. You can look out the window and see the hanging tyre. You can see the witch book. But I think the main reason why this is number one for me is the shock factor at the ending. Now, obviously, because of Until Dawn and Man of Medan, you know that character's going to die. But for me, I don't know why, I just found it so shocking when all of the family, up from Anthony, got killed off. You have this like opera-like music in the background. It's really tense. Obviously, all the family die in different ways. The dad gets crushed. The mum's in the bath. Taylor can die in two different ways, which pays off later on, which is fantastic. She can either get burnt or hang. And then obviously Megan just dies on the stairs. There's a brilliant visual that I love in this prologue, and it's when you play as Anthony and it says either help Megan or help Taylor, and you've just got this burning house in the background, and I absolutely adore that. And then obviously moving into Curator's Cut, another big plus is that you get to play as Tanya, and you get to have some exchanges with Vince outside about how, she's in a bad family. She gets to see upstairs, and you can talk to Dennis and Megan, and you can find more clues. So like, honestly, I remember thinking this at the time, and even after finishing The Devil in Me, that Little Hope is actually so strong It's such a shame because I feel like the rest of the game does tend to let it down. So there we go. Early doors, Little Hope is the best for me.
Yeah, very solid points, and it's why I've given Little Hope the silver medal. Little Hope falls second for me. So just to echo some of your points, mate. I mentioned before Man of Medan, I thought it wasn't subtle enough for me. I thought the Little Hope one was a lot more. Probably could have been done a little bit better, but I just thought it was handled much better with like the bus driver going through, building that hesitation, the fact that he really does want to drive through this town, Little Hope. To echo on your point as well, mate, about the dysfunctional family, this might be the only game I can ever think of ever really where the prologue characters have probably exceeded the actual cast. I've been very vocal about how I'm not a fan of the Little Hope cast, even from the main actor being, fairly wooden. I really bought into this dysfunctional family. It talks about themes such as friendship and sibling kinship, job loss, alcoholism, neglect. It then buys in later to the big story about how this factory's closing down and it leaves some big breadcrumbs. It's just absolutely fantastic. Even from a horror element where you've got Megan and this creepy monster, which I really wanted to be more part of the game, to be honest. And it can also really mislead you to the later game for framing Mary, which I thought was a really neat touch. I really love the 70s theme that's going on with the vinyls, the TV, the fashion going on in the background. And yeah, like you mentioned, the shock factor, the house fire, it just comes out of nowhere. You've got this really creepy thing and it all amps up in this really horror scene where you've got this creepy girl going around locking people into their or like out on the balcony, turning the gas up high, that kind of stuff. But the biggest factor that this comes so high for me, and it also is what you mentioned, is that one of your choices can affect something later on in the game, which I don't think many of the other prologues do. And that is the fact that Tanya can either go back in the house or escape via the reef, and she can either hang or burn, and this affects what kind of monster Taylor will get on later on in the game. So yeah, like, just to echo everything there and sum it up really, I really love this family, and it was such a strong prologue to tee up what, as you said, was actually maybe a pretty underwhelming game that missed the mark. I really bought into Anthony and Tanya over Andrew and Taylor, for example, and I definitely preferred Dennis over Daniel. Where it falls a little flat, why it doesn't come first for me, and I'll speak more about that when I praise the other prologue, which I will afterwards. But yeah, like, I just have to reiterate what I've been saying all this time. I thought this game was such a waste of Will Poulter's acting ability. We've seen him in movies such as like the Maze Runner films, his performance in Black Mirror Bandersnatch. Will Poulter is a fantastic actor, one of the best upcoming British actors I've ever seen. And it's got to be one of his weakest performances. Now, I know it's tough to rate him in a video game where he's predominantly voice acting, but even like his lines seem very sort of wooden and a bit dull, like he doesn't really care to be there. Maybe it's something to do with the face model and the animations, maybe it's a criticism at that part. And I also think that this prologue just does still get a little bit dampened by the fact its game misses the mark, and then it probably waters down the prologue for me. But still very strong. Really interesting, because I'm not too big a fan of Little Hope, but I thought the prologue was actually pretty fantastic. So, House of Ashes, I've given number one. Yeah, it's quite a difficult one, and I actually had Little Hope. I thought Little Hope was going to be what ranked first, but I switched out for this one. Gold medal for me. I thought it was the most beautiful prologue from a cinematic point of view, and the aesthetic. It's fantastic. I know they all completely hit the mark in the sense of like you've got the ghost ship, you've got the Fair Hotel in the 1890s. But I just absolutely loved it. We get visuals outside the pyramid with like the war that's going on. We get a really beautiful shot of the eclipse. I think graphically it might be the best one. I love the look of like the fashions that's going on between the Akkadians and the Gutians, and just the look of the temple and all the different like soldiers and warriors and kings we get going on. It starts off pretty gripping as well. Just an opening shot of a decapitation of all these Gutian heads. It's really kind of tense. I also really like the Balafu and Kurum fight, the way that they're fighting one another, one gets locked up, and then they have to team up, and I think that's a really good foreshadow to what comes later on in the House of Ashes game, where the Akkadians and the Gutians are fighting, but then have to team up versus these vampire bat creatures, the same way that the Americans and the Iraqis have to later. I like the fact there's glimpses of the monster, but it doesn't spoil it too much. We mainly see them through claws going around doors, through shadows on the wall, or POV shots. And I quite like the choice element as well, the fact that you can fight or betray Kurim as Balafu. The biggest reason it takes the number one spot for me, like I echoed with Little Hope, there's a massive choice in here which will affect the later game. Kind of in a very similar vein, but there's only a reason it just edges over Little Hope for me. So like obviously as Balafu and Kurim, you have to fight these vampire bat monsters, and whoever survives or at least dies last gets to be the main villain in the game. And for me it was Balafu because I succeeded the QuickTime events, so I got to fight this Balafu character, which was really cool. And Kurim was this corpse on the ground at one point that Salim and Jason found while he was cocooning. Now, I later learned that they can switch roles based off of how successful you were with the prologue, and you can actually have Balafu against the wall, kind of like being kept alive by this, like, you know, mysterious alien goo stuff, while, you know, Kurim is the main villain, and I thought that was fantastic. I really like that. It is very much like the Little Hope one, but House of Ashes does slightly pick the post for me because of the beauty. I just can't get over the colour palette and the beautiful shots of the temple scenes and that very golden feel to the prologue. I thought it was fantastic, but quite a difficult time period to capture. Now, obviously it's first, but it's not without its criticisms. I do think, you know, the opening is a little tedious. There are points where it is a bit dialogue heavy, and I do think that choice of the spear is a little lackluster, where you've got to kill your daughter or whatever. A bit of a nothing choice, really. It's probably just a tutorial based one, just to show you how like the aim mechanic works. I have seen a few people complain about this prologue as well, the fact that the Mesopotamians should be cast as Middle Eastern, and I have seen unhappiness of, like, you know, basically the characters they got to cast these people, it is slightly historically inaccurate, and I know that has caused a bit of friction. So, you know, I thought I should flag that, because I know that is going to voice what some people do think about this prologue. But I just thought it was very strong, teed up what was such a terrific game for me. So House of Ashes takes the gold medal for the prologues, mate.
Wow, I'd no idea about the historical inaccuracies in there. So there's a little lesson learned. But, I mean, mate, I'm going to have to say that I echo a lot of what you just said. But this is where me and you deviate a lot. So for me, House of Ashes has the weakest prologue, but I'll get all the positive, because let's face that, like, I like all of these prologues. By no means am I shitting on the House of Ashes prologue. I do like it. It just so happens that I prefer the other three. So we'll get through the good stuff. I like the fact that it introduces the whole quote and crow introduction thing, the way the camera pans and it says about some decisions save lives, you know, some bring about death. I thought that was really cool. To echo what Liam said, the visuals are fantastic. Horrific opening shot with the three heads on the counter. You have a bit of a fight. There's obviously the temple, and then there's that shot where you're looking at, I forgot what the guy's name is, Nassim or something like that, when you can see the eclipse in his eyeball, which was fantastic. Thought like the general audio of the monsters as well was really good, and I must admit I do love the fact that you can betray your comrade at the end. I thought that was actually a fantastic addition to the game, considering that they really are trying to pin you both together as, like, as brothers in arms sort of thing. I think for me, and this is a purely subjective thing, is that I just buy into the war period, the Victorian period, and the 1970s vibe of Little Hope more than this whole temple and gods thing that's going on. So while the visuals to me and the colour palette was absolutely extraordinary, I just wasn't as invested in this whole setup compared to the others. And I think that where it does fall down a bit for me as well is Curator's Cut. So, like, of course you do play as Kuran, don't you? And you break out the cell. But I think whenever I think of the House of Ashes prologue, my mind immediately just goes to them two walking around chatting to one another, and the curator's cut doesn't offer much else in that sense, because it sort of finishes the same way, where you can betray one another, and whoever dies last becomes the main villain in the body of the game, which I found a little bit disappointing. Overall, I've got to say that it is still a solid prologue, but unfortunately for me personally, it does take the number 4 slot. Okay, so obviously only one more slot left to fill. So The Devil in Me has the second best prologue, in my opinion. Again, I'll echo the whole introduction with the crow and the quote. On the downside, this has been a bit nitpicky, I'll admit. When they're walking to the hotel, I found the dialogue a little bit corny. I don't know if that's, on the writers. I don't know if they're trying to mimic the talk of the times or something. I know that they're just married and stuff, but I did find it a bit corny. Then, of course, you then come into this hotel, and again, the visuals are absolutely fantastic. The way that they've got the ornate decor in there, the sort of the lighting, and even sort of the clothing that the characters are wearing, very authentic to that time period, which I loved. I thought that the guy that voiced Holmes did a brilliant job of towing that line between being sinister but also saying nice things, so you weren't quite sure about him. I do like the fact as well that you get to choose items, whether it's in curator's cut, it doesn't really matter too much, but more in theatrical cut with Marie, where you get to pick items, and obviously they don't matter in the long run, but they do have their consequences of salt in that bathtub scene. I think as well, another big thing that I like is the different deaths. So, of course, if you don't investigate, you can have Marie drown in the bathtub. Equally, she can get killed by a razor blade. In Curator's cut as well, I think Jeff can die with Marie at the bathtub because Holmes comes up behind him and slits his throat. And having to add that, by the way, in Curator's cut, you get to punch H.H. Holmes, which I think is just a fantastic thing to throw in there, rather than see Jeff run off to the other room. And I think as well, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that, after that's whole played out and you see, and it's like the cycle continues, there's this shot of like a wedding ring behind the glass. And I think that that's Marie's wedding ring. At least that's how I interpreted it. And I thought that's like a sadistic way of like the killer showing almost like his trophy in many ways, but in like a way that no one would really suspect, which I thought was brilliant. The only negative, and I think that this is being a bit nitpicky, it would have been good to see if Jeff could actually have died on the spikes, if you do fail the QTE. I thought that would have added a little bit more importance to that choice. And maybe you could say that it was a little bit slow at the beginning where they're going into the hotel, especially when you're doing repeat playthroughs where, if you're trying to just get all of the items for the inventory and you have to keep replaying it to pick different items. It can be a little bit of a chore to have to listen through that dialogue. But again, take that with a pinch of salt, because I think that is a bit of a nitpicking on my part there. So yeah, Devil in Me, second best prologue in my opinion.
Sweet. So my final spot, as you can tell, is Devil in Me gets the bronze medal and it falls third. So the best thing, to echo what Jack has said, is H.H. Holmes' performance, and whoever voice acted this, fantastic job. He gets that chilling nature across so well as being accommodating. I especially love his dialogue when he's just killed either Jeff or Marie, and he's saying things like, "Don't fight it, it's already done." It's just, he's so chilling, and I absolutely was obsessed with this performance. It teed up the game very well. I think this whole hotel prologue sets up the game very well. You've got this guy like introducing him to the hotel, and then it just tees up everything later on in the story just fantastically. Like you mentioned, the different deaths are pretty phenomenal. It's nice to see that. like I mentioned as well, it does a very good job of catching the time period. This 1890s hotel, the aesthetic looks spot on. And like you mentioned as well, with the ring at the end, and then you've got two new people who check into the hotel. It really captures that cycle element in a similar manner that I said was foreshadowed brilliantly by House of Ashes with the camaraderie, the enemy of the enemy is my friend, or whatever. But the cycle element is fantastic. The way that it sets up the game as well, because there's a specific ending in The Devil in Me where that also can have a cycle ending depending on your choices. So yeah, that was just absolutely brilliant. Where this prologue falls flat for me is that it's too predictable. We knew what would happen from the get-go, even before we played the game, when we saw a snippet of the prologue in the trailer. We knew that two people would be checking into the hotel and they would be getting killed off by the host. So the whole time I'm playing it, I'm sat there for 20 minutes knowing what I'm walking into. And it would have been nice to have had more of a twist element, or maybe just something slightly different. I don't really know how they could have gone around that, though, so that is one thing I will defend that on. I thought the characters are arguably the worst ones we've had, as in Jeff and Marie. Probably the most bleak. I know I said I didn't like Charlie and Joe in Man of Medan. They're pretty unlikable, how they're drunk and fighting over a bit of change. But these guys, like we said it in the character tier list, they're just plot devices. We just have two honeymooners who are in love, and there's nothing really past that. It's not a criticism to them. That's just how the prologue had to be. So yeah, Jeff and Marie, I don't exactly get a giant kick out of playing them the way I would with, say, another character. I thought the choices were a little nothing-esque. Like, the curator cut didn't add too much for me. I know there is a bit of variety, like you could punch H.H. Holmes, you can die in different areas, but like the powder versus the rose water just wasn't too concrete a great choice for me. I thought the others, definitely had a more staple sort of effect or impact on the later game. This prologue doesn't really affect the later game. It doesn't affect sort of Mark and Kate and Charlie's story in any way, shape or form, I don't really think. I could be wrong on that, so obviously correct me in the comments, guys, if I am wrong. To echo what you said as well, the spike death, it would have been nice, but I do think every prologue probably has an element of this. Like, I know, for example, in Man of Medan, if you fail the heartbeat sequence where there's that soldier that's there, or your sergeant or whatever, he won't kill you, he'll just run off and scream. So, the choice is a bit, of a choice there. I was actually contemplating whether I've just played this, so I still have the goosebumps from The Devil in Me, since this game only came out like less than a month ago. So, the more I actually think about it, the more that this actually might be lower than Man of Medan, and it might actually get fourth if I really think about it. So it's bronze, but it's teetering on whether it does slip to fourth for me. Still a very good prologue, one that set up the game fantastically though. But yeah, the reason Little Hope and House of Ashes ranked the best for me is because they had an impact on the game, and that was one of the biggest sort of reasons I have given towards making the list the way I have done. That is
I think that's a fair comment, isn't it? I think we've both tried to encompass all of the things, whether it's the aesthetic, the choices, the impact later on. But I think to almost like compare against our lists, I think you're more thinking about how it impacts the later game. Maybe I'm thinking a little bit more on, sort of like the visuals perhaps, or like just certain biases with what I like in a video game. But wow, I mean, what a bombshell to end on. I mean, it's Devil in Me's close to the bottom on your list. That'll be certainly interesting to see in the comments. So obviously, guys, do let us know what your rankings are. Maybe give some reasons as well, because I feel this was actually more difficult than what I thought. I don't know what you think, mate, but it took me a little while to try and piece some of these together, and you could even argue that like even now, like some of these things could move around a bit.
Yeah, you know what's super interesting? I've just combined our scores together, mate, if I've tallied them. And basically, Man of Medan is ranked the lowest for us if we combined our scores.
All right.
House of Ashes House of Ashes and The Devil in Me are joint second, and Little Hope is the overall winner. We've basically said that Little Hope, first and second, it's overall we think is the best. So if we combined it, our stats look like this on screen. So yeah, guys, tell us what you think of that as well. Obviously, like we've mentioned before, these lists are completely subjective. Jack and I have based our lists off of different things, really. Let us know in the comments what your lists are. Give us reasons why. Tell us who was closest to yours as well. Who do you think had better reasonings? We're really fascinated to find these things out.
Fantastic. Before we wrap up, I'll just give a little shout out to Casey, one of our DPA friends that we met on Twitter a little while ago. He started up a YouTube, so definitely go and check that out. We'll put a link in the description.
Thank you very much, guys. Check out our Discord, our other social medias, links are in the description, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye for now.